Buonasera a tutti, e benvenuti al Teatro Bellissimo il Westdale. I couldn't resist treating you to my Anglo version of Italian, which I find you'll find is quite appropriate to this filmmaker. But before we begin and get started tonight, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the sponsor of the Westdale's World Masterworks series, BIC Advisors, and to the Art Gallery of Hamilton Film Festival for co-presenting tonight's 1957 Academy Award-winning film by director Federico Fellini, La Notte di Cabiria, Nights of Cabiria. If seeing this extraordinary film together wasn't enough, we're honored this evening to be joined by one of the key film scholars of Italian cinema and an expert on the works of Fellini, Professor Emeritus of Queen's University, Frank Burke. Professor Burke has published 5 books on Fellini, most recently in 2020, Fellini's Films and Commercials from Post-War to Postmodernism, and was a contributing editor with Marita Gubareva and the late Marguerite Waller on The Wily Blackwell, a companion to Federico Fellini. So if that wasn't enough, you can also hear Professor Burke's commentary on the prestigious label Criterion Collection's restorations of Roma, Il Bidone, and Amarcord, in which he collaborated with the late Peter Brunet. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Frank Burke. And as Frank is coming up to the stage, I did just want to quickly mention, Frank's going to chat with us for a bit, and then we're going to wrap up after the screening, a quick little break, go to the concession, grab a drink, and then come back. We're going to have a good conversation about the film, about Fellini, and of course, answer any questions or hear your thoughts on your experience of seeing this amazing film. Thank you, Frank.
Thanks, Jeff and Neil and everyone who's responsible for this event, and thank you for coming. And it's just wonderful to be here. I've heard for several years about the Westdale renovations. We have a very modest by comparison theater in Kingston, the screening room, and it's just very moving to be here. So it's again, thank you everybody for making that possible. I have my cheat sheet here. I'm going to talk about a few things very briefly. No spoilers for the film, and then as Jeff mentioned, we'll have a question and answer period after the movie. I wanted to talk very briefly about the history of Italian film, or the 3 great moments in Italian film in terms of its international impact, all 3 of which Fellini in some way or other was connected to. The first thing, there was a film called Cabiria made in 1914 by Giovanni Pastroni, which had tremendous international impact. It was the first film shown at the White House, and it also influenced D.W. Griffith, particularly in Intolerance, but it had tremendous influence on the American epic film at the time. And of course, Cabiria, Fellini's Cabiria, is a reference back to the origins of Italian cinema. So at the very beginnings of cinema, Italy was extraordinarily important. And then its next major moment of importance was Neo-Realism in the post-war period. Roberto Rossellini's Rome Open City in 1945 and Paisan in 1948, or 1946 really, enjoyed tremendous reception in the United States. The former ran for 70 weeks in New York City, and the latter was the largest, the highest grossing foreign film of its year. So Neo-Realism and also the other thing about Neo-Realism is it's the most influential movement. Movement's not really the right word for it, was more a convergence, a kind of shared sensibility that developed in the post-war period. But it was the most influential and I'll use the word movement because it's the best word in the context, in the history of cinema. It greatly influenced Third World cinema. It greatly influenced Indian cinema. It had impact everywhere. outside of Italy. So neorealism was important not only within Italy and not only extremely successful in North America, but it also was extremely important worldwide. Fellini's La Strada, made in 1953, is a bridge between neorealism and the third great moment of Italian cinema, which was the auteur cinema, or art cinema of the 1950s and 60s and on into the 1970s. La Strada had a 3-year run in New York City, and it won the first of 5 Oscars that Fellini won, and he won an Oscar as well for Nights of Cabiria. And the principal character, the principal actress in both La Strada and Nights of Cabiria is Giulietta Messina, and I'll mention that again in a moment. Talking a little bit about neorealism and the relationship of Fellini to neorealism. Neorealism kind of ran on 2 tracks or emerged on 2 tracks in the post-war. First of all, there were the films themselves. And second of all, there was a Marxist critique built around the films by left-wing critics in Italy at the time. And very often the left-wing critics tried to theorize a movement, whereas the filmmakers were making films that were all very different. And they, as I say, they had a shared sensibility, but they really weren't they weren't theorizable in any kind of simplistic way. But the main sort of thrust of neorealism, it was a reaction to fascism. It was a reaction to the years of illusion of rhetoric living under fascist rule, and also the years of fascist cinema, which were basically studio-made, very artificial films dealing with bourgeois values, similar in many ways to the screwball comedies in Hollywood, more or less at the same time. So there was a reaction to that kind of rhetoric and a return to what Italians felt was a real that had been concealed under the years of fascism, the realities, the socio-political realities of the world in which people lived. For the Marxists at the time, they were hoping this would be a revolutionary cinema that would create a sense of human solidarity that had been lacking as far as they were concerned under fascism. And more than that, would lead to the awakening of a new Italian republic. There was a sense that the Italian republic that was formed at the end, or the Italian nation that was formed at the end of the 19th century, was a failed experiment culminating in fascism. And that the end of fascism gave Italy the opportunity to have a genuine moment of nation building. So that was very much on the minds of the Marxist critics at the time. In terms of the characteristics of neorealism, there was a documentary openness to reality, a privileging of fact or reconstituted fact rather than make-believe, the use of on-location shooting instead of sets, the use of non-professional actors, often working class, and most of the most famous neorealist films were urban stories, an emphasis on the commonplace over the exceptional. And in terms of film technique, an emphasis on mise-en-scène rather than montage. In other words, what was in front of the camera rather than the editing that could create a cinematic reality apart from the reality that was unfolding in front of the camera. And I think that's it's important in looking at Nights of Cabiria that we see aspects of this, though Fellini himself was never a documentarist, as most people know. In terms of Fellini's relationship to neorealism, he worked on Roma Open City and he worked on Paisan. He worked with Roberto Rossellini, and he even did some shooting on the making of Paisan. But he always had a strong sense of parody. He started out as a caricaturist before he got into film. And he also had a strongly poetic sensibility, which tended to set him apart from Rossellini, as well as he moved into the 50s and 60s, and we'll see some of this in Nights of Cabiria. He had an increasing interest in psychological and imaginative expression rather than realist expression. That got him into trouble with the Marxist critics in Italy, but it also brought him international acclaim. Cabiria, Nights of Cabiria, is an interesting example in this respect, that on the one hand, it deals with a real social issue at the time, prostitution, but it does so in the way of being a kind of fable. And La Strada, too, is a kind of fable. So Fellini was a realist, fabulist, in a sense, at this point, early in his career. In terms of just briefly some traits of Fellini's work, he loved marginal figures. He would go out into the streets very often with Pier Paolo Pasolini in the 1950s to discover the underworld of Rome and get to know the streetwalkers, the prostitutes that were living in the city. He loves a circus, and he loves clowns, and you'll see within Giulietta Messina's performance this element of the clown, which is very, very important, both in La Strada and in Nights of Cabiria. He placed women at the center of his films in a way that was unusual in the 1950s for male directors. There were European directors such as Antonioni, Bergman, and Fellini who did this, and there were Hollywood directors. There was a femme fatale sort of influence of the 1940s and directors like King Vidor who focused on women. But basically, the kind of emphasis that the Europeans placed on women was somewhat different and remarkable for Fellini. It's one of the things that attracted me to him when I first began to see his films. La Strada, Nights of Cabiria, Juliet of the Spirits all have female protagonists, and they're, of course, all played by Giulietta Messina. He focuses on the abuse of women, which is another thing that was remarkable, I think, in the 1950s. La Strada, Nights of Cabiria, and even La Dolce Vita. You'll see the evidence of this, dealing with prostitution and the exploitation of women in Nights of Cabiria, but also in La Dolce Vita, which many of you have probably seen. There's not a single female character who is not abused in one way or another by male characters. So Fellini was very sensitive early in his career to the problem of the abuse of women. He emphasizes at this stage, and he's beginning to really do this with Nights of Cabiria, what I call psycho-spiritual development. The awareness of self, the awareness of the world, and also the importance of the interrelatedness of self and world. And I think Nights of Cabiria is very much about that particular issue. And in this respect, we'll see a moment where Cabiria asks herself, what if I died? And suddenly she has an awakening to her sense of self. And then later in the film, she'll get caught up in this kind of spiritual quest where she'll be sort of mesmerized by the appearance of pilgrims moving through the streets of Rome. And then she'll go to a shrine, the shrine of divine love, where she seeks dramatic transformation. And so this is another stage in her awakening. And then that's followed by a sequence at the Lux Theater where she makes contact with her unconscious. So the film shows us a character who's gradually becoming more psychologically developed, more spiritually attuned. That's sort of my one spoiler. And I have one other little spoiler that I will provide. In this context, prostitution ends up becoming metaphoric as well as sociological, and perhaps metaphoric more than sociological, in the sense that prostitution is treated as a physical form of love or basically sexual activity. And gradually what Cabiria learns to do is broaden out from that and encompass more spiritual forms of love. And you'll see how that develops in the course of the film. It could be ground for critique, and has been within Fellini, that in turning prostitution into metaphor, he somewhat conceals or doesn't pay appropriate attention to the actual socio-political reality of it. One little historical detail that I think is interesting in relationship to the film is the Merlin Law was passed in 1958, named after the woman legislator who introduced the law. And this was, it ended the legality of bordellos within Italy. And it was an attempt to reduce exploitation of women, and it was meant to eliminate government control over sexual activity and over women's bodies. But the downside of it was that it ended up tossing all the women who'd been working in bordellos out into the streets. Now, this occurs slightly after Nights of Cabiria, but the discourse around prostitution and how to deal with it and how to address the problem of the exploitation of women was very much in the air, culminating in the Merlin Law. There's a wonderful film called Adjua and Her Friends, which is available on Blu-ray and DVD and Criterion, made in 1960, that deals with the consequences of the Merlin Law. And the last words I want to utter before you watch the movie are Giulietta Messina, Giulietta Messina, Giulietta Messina. She's just so extraordinary in this film. And she, being really the star of both La Strada and Nights of Cabiria, both of which won Oscars for Fellini and created his international acclaim, she basically was the reason why Fellini became the famous director that he was able to become, able to acquire funding and support and make the movies of the 1960s that he did. But she is absolutely fundamental to the development of Fellini as an artist, and remains so even as a central figure in Ginger and Fred in the mid-1980s. So enjoy the film, and we will be able to discuss it further afterwards. Thank you.
Wow, what a performance. How many of you have seen Nights of Cabiria before tonight? Just a show of hands.
Oh, very few.
So this was a first screening, and what a wonderful opportunity to see it on a big screen. I've screened it a few times in preparation for this evening, but there's so much that I missed in the expressions in Giulietta Massina's face. Now, before we get to Federico Fellini, I wanted to read a quote from Janet Maslin of the New York Times from 1998, which was during its previous restoration on 35 millimeter. And it was the first time I saw the film in Toronto in '99, wintry afternoon. She writes, "There's more grace and courage in the famous image of Giulietta Messina smiling through her tears in Federico Fellini's 1957 Nights of Cabiria than there is in all the fire-breathing blockbusters Hollywood has to offer," which I think is, quote, more relevant today than ever. And I'm wondering, Frank, maybe before we dive into Fellini, can we spend a little time first talking about Giulietta and her performance in this film, as well as her place in his work? I know you mentioned it a bit in the introduction, but I'd love to explore her a little bit more if we can.
Yeah, well, I mean, she and Fellini met when they were doing radio around 1943, I think, and Fellini wrote a series that she performed in, Chico and Paulina, I think was the name of it. So they met and they got married shortly after that, and then their first child, they had one child who died when it was about 2 or 3 weeks old, I think, which was a weight that I think carried through their relationship for the rest of their lives. And she was a very well-known actress within Italy at the time. And then with La Strada, of course, they won an Oscar together, Nights of Cabiria as well. And after that, she didn't really do that much. She didn't do much filmmaking with other directors, and some people claim Fellini didn't want her to. I really haven't found any significant evidence of that. But she then started a column for one of the newspapers or magazines, sort of an advice column, which is really good. I mean, she was great at giving advice. And then in the 70s, she became a television star. She was in 2 different series. And Fellini has joked that, and it's actually the case, that he would walk down the street with Giulietta Messina, and people would say, "Oh, there's Mr. Messina." That he was losing his reputation as she was regaining a new identity as a television actress. But I mean, she's been ignored, I think, except in the last 3 or 4 years. 2 or 3 books have come out in Italy about her, but and Fellini wrote a very nice book in homage to her many years ago. So I mean, to me, I don't think I've seen a better performance in the history of cinema than her performance in Cabiria. So I mean, it moves me. I can barely speak. So.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. The shot we just experienced, I think it's one of the most enduring images in cinema, and let alone Fellini's work. In a letter to a Jesuit priest, Fellini wrote they were asking to ask a little bit about spirituality and religion, and I thought maybe we could explore that a bit in his films. But he wrote this letter to this Jesuit priest, and I'm taking an excerpt from that letter. But and I think it says a lot about that image that we just were left with. The lyrical quality of my inspiration, which is always an act of love, allows me to smile at the weeping face, to stretch out a hand to someone about to slip down and be lost. And I think, if we think about his placement of spirituality and religion in his films, he says that's his focus is, an intuitive way to do good by people and to help people, and even those that are downtrodden or that are maybe prone to evil deeds, that by with love, that perhaps it can help people overcome that. What has in your research and your history with researching Fellini, what have you found his relationship to religion and?
Well, I think in this film, I just want to comment on a second thing you said, and I'll come back to that, which is that there's a strong sense of optimism about human solidarity in this film. There are communities everywhere. At the beginning of the film, it's very interesting when she's drowning, the number of people who come together. I mean, there's the clown who keeps putting his jacket off and on and doesn't get there. And it's part of the mixture of comedy and tragedy that's extraordinary in the opening scene. And then, of course, with the mascara and the tears and the smile at the end of the film. So one of the things that struck me is that Fellini had a much more positive view of human nature at this point in his career than he did later on. And the number of instances in which people help each other out, when the Shrine of Divine Love, for instance, over and over again, there's a sense of compassion and love. That I think he and you talk about love as such an important theme of his, and I think it's really, really prominent here. His relationship to religion, I think, is very clear in the pilgrimage sequence. One of the things that I think the film deals with is Cabiria's increasing ability to see beyond the scene. That as the pilgrims go by at night, she looks beyond the vanishing point. And again, with the pilgrims marching at the Feast of Divine Love. And it gets her into trouble at times because she gets smacked in the head when she goes through the glass, when she hits the glass door at Lazzare's place. So seeing beyond the scene, I think, is a very, very important aspect of this film. And the most beautiful example of it to me is when she looks at us at the end of the film. We're not there. We're present, but we're not seen. And the seeing beyond the scene becomes Fellini's metaphor for spiritual experience. So I'm sorry if I get so moved, but this film just does it to me. So that the spiritual dimension is very important, and he really appreciates the ways in which religion, when it's playing its proper role in relation to human experience and human psychology, can enhance that. So one of the things that struck me about the pilgrimage is you get both sides of it. You get all the stuff that's being sold. You got the emphasis on spectacle. You've got the sense of the institution of religion, and especially the authoritarianism and submissiveness that's associated with religion. But still, the ritual is overwhelming. It's powerful. It grabs Cabiria, and it makes her transform, and it makes her talk about change. And it's a fundamental scene in the film for her because she's beginning to really recognize the need to change. And so transformation, the ways in which religion or spiritual experience can enhance transformation, is reflected even with negative aspects in his representation of institutional religion in the pilgrimage sequence. But one of the things that struck me tonight is that the scene at the Lux Theater becomes a commentary in a way on the pilgrimage sequence. You have the authoritarianism, the mind control, and the making people submit and do things that they don't want to do. I found a really interesting parallel between negative aspects of religion, which of course we can also tie into fascism and what fascism had been doing, and what happens at the Lux Theater with the mind reading and the imposition of one mind upon another. So it's very complex, but he never renounces the positive aspects of religion. He just renounces the materialism, the authoritarianism, the institutionalizing of the spirit.
We were speaking earlier about a scene or a sequence that had been removed from the film after its premiere at Cannes in 1957, and that's the scene in which they call it the man with the sack, the man going to the caves and providing charity to the less fortunate. What were your thoughts on seeing this on the big screen tonight, edited as it was back then? And what was its contribution, do you think, to that transformation that you just talked about for Cabiria?
It's the first time, it's actually the first time I've seen this film with the clip in it. I've seen the clip, obviously, many times, but I've actually not watched the film and seen the clip as part of it. A number of things struck me. One is that narratively, it seems to stick out a bit. When it's not there, you move immediately from her watching the pilgrims marching through the Passeggiata, where her work is at night, directly to the divine love, the visit to the shrine of divine love. So that really flows better, whereas the man with the sack sort of interrupts the flow on some level. But it's also, that's where she first names herself Maria. So it's really crucial in terms of what she's experiencing in terms of giving and in terms of love. And that's so important that Oscar, one of the things that I think happens in the film is that Oscar, though he ends up being a total fraud, he models for her a version of unconditional love, which is she's developing within herself. The ability to love beyond material goods, beyond material attachments. And I think that her discovery of herself as Maria, both the modeling of love that's offered by the man with the sack, and also her willingness to become Maria instead of Cabiria, which is a movie name, is very important in that scene. The other thing that struck me about it, watching it, as I talked a bit about the relationship between Fellini and Neo-Realism, that scene is very Neo-Realist in terms of the way it's shot. And it gives you a sense of Rome, of people struggling in Rome, and this figure who is very austere. It reminded me of a character in Rome Open City, the Marxist, the communist in Rome Open City, who was ideologically very committed, but also extremely austere, as the man with the sack is. But it really provided a lengthy view of a side of Rome that generally is underemphasized in the film because Cabiria's performances, Messina's performance is so powerful. So I think it performs a number of functions in the film. But again, in terms of narrative flow, I don't know that it increases the coherence of the film.
And it was removed originally because there were some criticism from the church that it was an indication that why should a stranger who's not affiliated with the church be providing charity when this is really a function of the Catholic Church? And I found that kind of interesting to speculate on that.
Yeah, no, definitely, that was it.
We were switching to Fellini and his films. We've read a lot about the Knights of Cabiria, marking a transition point for Fellini. His next film would be the cultural sensation La Dolce Vita in 1960, and then arguably his masterpiece, if you forgive these labels, 8½. When you stand back and look at this film, do you see any indication or example of what was to come in terms of his storytelling technique and his film style?
Yeah, I'm glad we talked about that before the movie because it allowed me to sort of focus a bit on that. The pace. First of all, La Strada is a much slower film than this. La Dolce Vita is just over-the-top movement. Characters living lives just at a frenetic pace out of their search for some sort of happiness that they can't find. So particularly the early parts and the comic parts of this film, the pace is so quickly. And so that's one thing, that his movie style changes and really moves toward La Dolce Vita in terms of pace. Numbers of characters that, again, the throngs that we see at times in the scenes with the prostitutes and the pimps, for instance, and the music. And then the divine love pilgrimage. The numbers of people, if you see La Dolce Vita, they're just characters coming in and out of the frame constantly. So those two things really struck me. The miracle sequence here gets repeated very much in La Dolce Vita. The difference being, which is I struck me as very interesting in terms of Fellini's evolution, is that the spectacle is represented through in a theatrical way in La Dolce Vita, in Nights of Cabiria. In La Dolce Vita, it's being televised. It's being shot. There's documentary footage, and the characters, the girl and boy who presumably witnessed the miracle, are being directed. So it's all being done for televisual purposes. So we move from theater to television, which is interesting in terms of the development of media within Italy. The other scenes that reminded me very much of La Dolce Vita is the scene between Alberto Lazzari and Jessie, his girlfriend, which recalls a relationship between Robert and Sylvia, Anita Ekberg in La Dolce Vita. So there's some content issues and there's some style issues. And the growing, you wanted to mention this, so I'll throw it in now, is a growing awareness of what's happening to Italy as the economic miracle of the 1950s and early 60s is developing. Italy went through what became known as an economic miracle, or the boom, between 1958 and 1963, though the signs of it are there in Nights of Cabiria, the money, and when she drops that money at the end of the film and allows herself, in a sense, to die and be reborn as someone now freed of her material goals. That is almost a statement about Italy becoming more and more capitalist, becoming the society of Italy being increasingly defined along American lines. So it's 2 years before the economic miracle, but it's a prophecy, whereas La Dolce Vita is right smack in the middle, and it's a very strong critique of a kind of loss of identity in the midst of the extreme materialism that came along with the economic miracle.
You talk about marginal characters in his films.
And being the film nerd that I am, was in Rome several years ago and decided to figure out, well, where did Fellini hang out? So I went to the Piazza del Popolo and hung out at Canova, which I recommend. It's a great place to watch people, which is why I suspect, aside from being around the corner from the Via Margutta where he lived, was another reason why he spent some time there. But I had an opportunity to speak to a waiter who was quite elderly. I love that in Italy, waiters live until they can't work any longer.
And then they used to go into Fellini films, because you see all Fellini's films.
Well, he informed me that he was Fellini would come and have a drink and read his newspaper in the morning and just watch people and point them out and ask for to give a little indication to people that were walking in the Piazza del Popolo to come to his office to be photographed. So I just just a shout out to Canova. I'm not sponsoring them or anything, but I just found it rather fascinating. And you can start to see those glimpses and glimmers of the marginalized characters. He really loved faces, and I you see it in the nightclub act.
Oh, jeez. And Wanda too. She's a fabulous character in this film. And the uncle, again, to me, what's so amazing to Fellini at this point in his career is his ability to mix critique and compassion at the same time. The uncle, who is clearly a pimp, made a lot of money off the exploitation of women, and somehow now he wants to buy back his health. And while on the one hand, there are all these things that point to a criticism of him, and that he's been sort of a horrendous person, but the anguish that he experiences and the anxiety that he experiences, Fellini represents that as well. And I think Fellini, as we got into a much more ideological phase of looking at movies and looking at cultural production in general in the 1980s and 90s, Fellini became criticized for the fact that he built compassion into critique, so that he was seen as not being a pure critic of capitalism, let's say. But I think his representation of the uncle is a really good example of that he loved all his characters. And he found it very difficult to be unqualifiedly critical of any of them.
You feel that love in his films about those characters is not a In recent years, there has been an excellent dialogue that's emerged, and you started to talk about it in your introduction, and I thought maybe we could expand on it slightly, Frank, and that's about gender parity and diversity in the film industry. But specifically to Fellini's movies, may I ask you to speak about women roles in his films?
Oh my God, we need a whole.
Well, that's what I know. We don't have a lot of time, but
okay. Well, I'll provide what my sense of sort of a brief overview of this. As I mentioned in the introduction, I think early in his career he was very sensitive to the central, and women were always central to him. But early in his career, his representations of women were much more realistic in a certain sense, even though there is always a fable dimension to them. One of the things that changes. And there are two major things that change, I think, for Fellini. One is the feminist movement, which is, he recognized, for instance, he made Juliet of the Spirits, and he had as his main character a woman going through a psychological process of liberation, similar to what happens in Nights of Cabiria, but after he'd encountered Jungian psychology, and so that the Jungian aspect is stronger in Juliet of the Spirits, although it's really, so much of it is here even before he encountered Jung, as in Nights of Cabiria. And but at a certain point, with the rise of feminism, even though people, I think, mistake, in a sense, City of Women as a critique of feminism, I think it's a critique of masculinity and a recognition of the need to redefine, for men to redefine their own masculinity. So one of the things that he said about his representations of women is that once you move into the 1970s, a man could not take it upon himself to think that he could work out a psychological process of a woman's growth, that kind of perspective needed to be provided by women. And so he shifted from trying to represent women's issues to a really strong critique in Casanova and City of Women of masculinity. But along with that, it's the second thing that happens is in 1960, he meets Bernard, he meets the Jungian psychoanalyst Bernard, who tells Fellini to start keeping a record of his dreams. And Fellini's dreams tended to be very erotic and very mythological. And once that happens, his representation of women changes dramatically. And it happens to a certain extent already with Anita Ekberg in La Dolce Vita. But from then on, his representation of women becomes more fantastic. And it becomes more a reflection of his own psychology rather than a representation of women's struggles, for instance, prostitution and Nights of Cabiria. So, and he basically left free rein to his imagination. He does all these incredible designs that have been published in the Book of Dreams, but into his films become these representations of women that become troubling. In an age of feminism, they become troubling. But a number of women filmmakers and a number of women theorists have pointed out the fact that the range of women's representations in his films is beyond that of any other male director, so that the emphasis not on the grotesque but on the unusual, on the non-normative within Fellini becomes a really, really important part of his representation later in his career. But it's an open question. I mean, whether some of these representations are really problematic, and whether his emphasis on himself really is basically as a Mediterranean male who never grew up and has always perceived women through really the eyes of classic Catholic issues such as motherhood and reproduction and so forth and so on, whether those are really, really problematic. And so it really is an open question, but things really do change with La Dolce Vita, with Anita Ekberg, and with his films from that point on.
I know I put you on the spot, and only gave you 3.5 minutes to answer that, but thank you, Frank. Yeah. It's a good beginning to a longer conversation for the future. I think if we let's open it up to the audience for any questions or thoughts that you might have had about the film, and we have someone that has a microphone that can deliver that, and I do see a hand up right there.
Thank you very much. That was awesome. I just have a question on whether or not there is baptism symbolism in the film, because there's certainly being cast into water, and then there's the whole thing where she wasn't thrown into the water, but she did shed all of her money and she was reborn in a sense. So, yeah, I just want your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Well, there's death and rebirth everywhere. Obviously, starting at the very beginning of the film, where she dies and is told she's been dead for 3 days, which is an interesting. What is it? There's some reference to 3 days in her death, which of course ties in with the notion of Christ. The movie actor that she runs into, his name is Lazarus, basically, and she redeems Lazarus. She brings him back to life. He goes from being this surly, nasty guy to somebody who's really softened in her presence. What you're saying about water is absolutely true, and it's really interesting to me. One of the things I noticed tonight is we go from the first scene where she's in the water, drowns basically, and is reborn, to when he says she's going to marry, when Oscar says to her that he's going to marry her, she's at a water fountain. And it's a very different relationship to water, in which she has control over the water, even though she's being fooled. And then finally, in the final scene, she's way above the water. So there's this, and as part of the movement of the film from the physical to the spiritual, I think that at the end we're way, way high up. We're in a different level of things, and removed from the kind of imminent death, even though there's the threat of drowning, even in the final scene. We're removed from the imminence of water, but certainly in baptisms and deaths and rebirths, they're certainly absolutely all over the place.
Do we have anyone else that would like to comment or have any questions for Frank?
As part of, this is perhaps trivial, but that very dramatic last scene, it struck me that her face makeup had changed. For perhaps the first half of the movie, she's got Charlie Chaplin type eyebrows. She's always got that look of astonishment. But then, is it the second half of the film, or only in that last scene? She's got a much more natural makeup face. Her eyebrows are normal.
Well, that's great. I mean, I don't know when that would change. But that's a fabulous observation. Fellini's designs, because he started as a cartoonist and he was very influenced by cartoons, eyebrows are extremely important in all of his sketches and his drawings, and particularly drawings of himself. And he very often does use the sort of Chaplin-esque, or Wilbur McCoy, or going back to some of the American cartoonists in the early part of the 20th century. So, and he had Casanova's eyebrows completely shaved off. So he was obsessed about what he was doing with eyebrows. So you really nailed something important there.
Well, there's a point in 8.5 also, which
Yes, yeah. Right.
There was a gentleman right in front. Thank you for your question, by the way.
I was just wondering, in that final scene, the young brunette girl who said hello to her, do you think there was any linkage? Was that her young self meeting her old self?
Yeah, no doubt about it. I think that all those figures who appear at the end of the film are reflections of her own spirits. And they also recuperate all sorts of figures from early in the film. The boys who helped save her at the very beginning, the band leader, the young band leader who chirps at her in the nightclub. There are all sorts of references to figures who have now been recaptured, sort of as parts of her own spirit, that she's assimilated everything she's experienced, and what's outside her is also inside her. So I definitely think that's Maria. I absolutely think that's what's going on. And that's one of the reasons why I see the film as such an incredible prophecy of his encounter with Jung, because Jung's psychology was very much about shadows and about the way in which we project onto the world ourselves, but ideally that inside and outside come together. And I think Fellini was trying to imagine that kind of, that's clearly an imaginative and a visionary view of the world, but I think that's what's going on at the end of the film.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
So the film was sort of about prostitution, and it was from the 50s, right? And they didn't really go into much detail for like today's standards or anything like that. But would have there been any like controversy or anything just for it, even talking about that at the time?
Oh, yes. I mean, there was a lot of criticism of Fellini for dealing with it, not because he didn't do an adequate sociological analysis of the problem, but because he was even putting on screen prostitutes. The church was very, very offended by this, and there was a huge battle, which is part of why The Man with the Sack got eliminated. There was a lot of negotiating that went on to get the approval of certain major figures in the Catholic Church for the film. So, yes, it was scandalous at the time, just dealing with it. But I mean, nowadays there might be more of a critique of the way he handles it, or turns it into metaphor rather than actually dealing with the consequences. So, but in those days, it was just merely putting something on screen that wasn't supposed to be on screen.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Thank you, sir.
Hi, I'm just wondering if you talk about the character of Oscar a little bit. He just seems so good and then so bad, and there's no nuance in that. And so I found that kind of shocking. I didn't expect it in this film. So I wonder if you could talk about him a bit.
Okay. In terms of Cabiria's development, he announces himself as an accountant, but the Italian word for it means a reasoner, a ragioniere. And what he does immediately to Cabiria when he meets her, and he's not doing this because he's a good guy. He's a creep. I mean, we know that. But when she comes out of the theater, he explains to her what she said under hypnosis. So he basically puts her in touch on a conscious level with her discovery of Maria, her discovery of her desire for love, her sincerity, and her, etc. So what he models for her is her own growing ability to love. And when he offers her everything unconditionally and says, I don't want to know about your past, etc., he's basically modeling something that she wants to do, she's developing within herself. So that's how he functions as a positive figure in her psychological development. As a creep, one of the things that used to bother me about Fellini's representation of him, and now I understand it perfectly, it's only taken me 35 years or whatever, is why is he so obviously sinister as we get into the later? Why is he wearing the dark glasses and he's got a toothpick in his mouth and stuff like that? And I thought, Fellini's trying to tell us that he's a bad guy? And I realized, no, that part of the problem of Cabiria seeing beyond the scene is that she can't see what's in front of her. So we can see that he's a creep, but until the very last minute, until we get the close-up of his eyes, and it's a beautiful image in a sense of finally she sees through his eyes who he is, that he's a bad guy and he's represented as a bad guy. But what's important is Cabiria, because she's so moved so much into sort of this meditative dream state that she can't see it for herself. So I think some of the part of the representation of evil is also her inability to see what's going on around her. And then when he leaves, she rolls in the leaves. I think it's a beautiful scene, and she sort of becomes one with the earth again, and she sort of regains her contact with reality through that rolling in the leaves, and then picking up the flowers and kind of becoming a bride of life, not a bride of Oscar or a bride of any man, but rather a bride of life as she moves into this procession at the end of the film. So I went a little bit beyond what you were saying, but those are some of my thoughts.
One of the key collaborators in Fellini's career and his works is, of course, Nino Rota, and the fabulous music that you hear in this film and Cabiria's theme, and just any musings or thoughts that you have about that, Frank?
It's just there's a really nice book on Nino Rota, which talks about the work he did not only for Fellini but for other directors, that goes into detail and the way that music functions in the film. But it's not something I've been thinking of recently, so I have to say it's good. It's great. But beyond that, my analysis of how it functions, I don't have one right now.
Yeah. In the first scene, when Giorgio steals her money and throws her in the river, he's trying to kill her.
Yeah.
In the last scene, what's his name? The man. Oscar. Does not kill her. Yeah. He could. He's ready to, I'm sure. Yeah. But he doesn't. What do you make of that?
I think one of the things that I love about the film, Cabiria is able to convert the figures, major figures that she runs into in the film. She meets Lazzari, I think I mentioned this before, and kind of brings him back to life because he's such a nasty person at the very beginning. The conjurer, after he does his mind reading thing, actually gets taken aback by the power of her sincerity, and he's shocked. And he can no longer play just the role of the conjurer. He's taken out of his role by her. And with Oscar, the power, again, of her love, of her, particularly in the last scene when they're walking through the woods, her complete openness and the dissolving of all the distance. She had given him the formal you up until the last scene of the film, and then she's giving him the informal you. So her use of language changes as she opens up to him and begins to talk informally to him. So it's the power of her grace that transforms figures that she runs into in the film, and I think she transforms. I mean, I think it's very idealistic on Fellini's part, as I say. I don't think he had this kind of confidence in human nature as he got older, but I think that's what happens at the end, that the power, that he can't do it. He becomes transformed by her spirituality, really.
Thank you. As we begin to wrap up, I have one question I wanted to ask you. And you've had a long relationship with Fellini's art, and I've often tried to imagine how, after working on so many articles and essays and commentaries and panels, how that relationship has changed over the years. And earlier, I mentioned one of your book credits, the Wiley Blackwell companion to Federico Fellini, that you published in time for the director's centenary in 2020. It's an extraordinary accomplishment, and with so many talents coming together to share their perspectives on the legacy of Fellini. While compiling this work, was there anything that surprised you? Is there anything new or a new perspective that you've gained in the last period of time?
Definitely new perspectives and things that I was really happy to see, because when I started writing about Fellini, I thought there were ways of interpreting his movies. And of course, tonight we're talking about certain conclusions we might want to draw or hypothesize about in terms of specific scenes or how the film might work. But the more I worked on Fellini, and the problem is, becoming an academic, I had to publish. And I realized that at a certain point, I lost touch with why I loved Fellini. And I love Fellini because of the impact of his work, not because it could be interpreted, although I think what he's trying to work through in Nights of Cabiria and so many of his films are certainly worth talking about on an intellectual level. But ultimately, his film language, the visceral nature of the way in which some of the scenes here are just so powerful in terms of the use of sound, the use of music, the way in which the camera works and the way in which performance works, that it's the impact of his work that I got brought back to that through editing this book. And a lot of people are now talking about sort of the cognitive aspects of film. And there was some really, really nice work that it was done in the companion to Federico Fellini on just the visceral aspects, his use of mist, his use of water, and his use of garbage bag seas in films like Casanova. That the less representational he becomes, the more of a kind of haptic and the more of a kind of visceral impact his films have. And I think he moved from being, his screenplays are very tight up until maybe La Dolce Vita. This would be the last film, which I think has a fairly clear narrative development. And then after that, it's the scenes, it's the sequences, it's the power of the images. It's so I think I've got liberated from my need to constantly interpret Fellini and brought back to the fact that what I love about him is the power, what I experience as the power of his work. And I think also academia is now, film academia has moved beyond this notion of interpretation or semiology, as was the fancy name for it, and beginning to recognize that art, beginning to go back to what's an obvious fact, that art works on us in a million different ways. It works on us sensually, not principally intellectually. And I think Fellini may well be rediscovered for that now. He was sort of, academics treated him very badly because they couldn't figure him out. And I think now if we approach his work as being sensuous rather than principally intellectual, that there may be that kind of, there may be a rediscovery of Fellini. So yes, definitely my relationship to him has changed tremendously over the years. And it's with great humility that I realize I've been wrong most of my life and will continue to be. So don't pay any attention to anything I've said tonight. I'll come back in a week and it'll all be different.
Well, thanks for spending time with us, Frank, and exposing us to your perspectives on
this has been wonderful. Thank you very much.